The rain came in sheets across the Pacific Island that November afternoon, turning the red clay roads into rivers of rust-colored mud that clung to everything it touched. Aiko Tanaka stood in the back of the military transport truck, her hand gripping the weathered wooden slat as the vehicle lurched over another pothole, and watched the palm trees bend under the weight of water and wind. 19 women pressed together in that truck bed, their bodies swaying with each violent turn, their faces blank masks hiding the terror that had been their constant companion for 3 days now. They had been told nothing except that they were being moved. In the silence between them lived all the propaganda they had absorbed during the war years, the stories of American soldiers as demons, as beasts who showed no mercy to Japanese women. Aiko's fingers found the small wooden music box in her pocket, the one her father had given her before she left Osaka, and she squeezed it until the edges cut into her palm. The physical pain was easier than the anticipation. When the truck finally shuddered to a stop and the canvas flaps were pulled back, Aiko expected to see leering faces, rough hands reaching for them. Instead, she saw a young American soldier, barely old enough to shave, step back immediately and avert his eyes. He gestured toward a gate in a high fence topped with wire, then turned his back to give them privacy as they climbed down. The mud sucked at Aiko's worn shoes as she stepped onto the ground. The other women huddled close, instinctively forming a protective circle, their eyes darting from the armed guards at the gate to the rows of tin-roofed barracks beyond. The compound stretched before them like a strange new world, orderly, geometric, utterly foreign. American flags snapped in the wind. Somewhere, a radio played music Aiko had never heard before, all brass and drums and unfamiliar rhythm. A tall man in sergeant's stripes approached them, stopping a respectful distance away. His uniform was crisp despite the rain, his boots caked with the same red mud that now covered their legs. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, as though he understood that any sudden movement might shatter them entirely. "My name is Sergeant Thomas Reed," he said, then paused while another man, clearly Japanese but wearing an American uniform, stepped forward to translate. The sight of him, this translator, this bridge between worlds, sent a ripple of confusion through the women. Some called men like him traitors. Others simply called them survivors. Aiko studied his face, searching for cruelty or shame, but found only a careful, practiced neutrality. "I am Kenji Sato," the translator said in Japanese, his Tokyo accent refined and clear even through the sound of rain drumming on metal roofs. "I know you are frightened. I know what you have been told about Americans. But I need you to listen carefully to what Sergeant Reed is going to say." He paused, letting his words settle. "You are now prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army. There are rules here, rules that will be enforced. No soldier is permitted to touch you. No man will enter your barracks without a female officer present. You will be examined by a female doctor only. You will receive rations, clothing, and medical care. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." He spoke each sentence slowly, as though he expected them not to believe a single word. Aiko didn't. She had heard lies before, dressed up in official language. She had heard promises that dissolved like sugar in rain. But when Sergeant Reed gestured toward the nearest barack and a woman emerged, an American woman in an officer's uniform, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression firm but not unkind, something shifted in Aiko's chest. The woman introduced herself as Lieutenant Ruth Hale, and her voice carried the same measured tone as the sergeant's, as though she had been trained specifically for this moment, this impossible task of convincing the unconvincible. "You will be assigned beds," Lieutenant Hale said through Kenji's translation. "You will have privacy curtains. You will have soap, towels, and clean clothing. Tomorrow, a female doctor will examine each of you, only if you consent. No one will force you. Do you understand?" The women nodded, but Aiko could feel the skepticism running through them like an electric current. They understood the words. They did not yet understand whether the words were true. The barracks smelled of fresh-cut wood and disinfectant, a sharp chemical scent that made Aiko's eyes water. Each bed had a thin mattress, a folded blanket, a small wooden box for personal belongings. Privacy curtains hung from wires, creating small compartments that were not quite rooms but also not quite the complete exposure Aiko had expected. She chose a bed near the back wall, where she could see both exits, and sat down carefully, as though the mattress might disappear if she applied her full weight. Around her, the other women moved like ghosts, silent and uncertain, each one processing this strange new reality in isolation. Outside, the rain continued its relentless percussion, and somewhere in the distance, Aiko heard men's voices singing, the words incomprehensible but the melody unmistakably American. Bold, brash, full of a confidence that felt almost violent in its certainty. That first night, no one slept. Aiko lay on her back, staring at the corrugated tin roof, listening to the breathing of 18 other women who were also pretending to sleep. Every sound made her tense. Footsteps outside, a door creaking, voices in English that could mean anything. But no one came. The American guards remained at their posts by the gates, distant and professional. When morning finally broke, pale and humid, Lieutenant Hale arrived with breakfast rations and more soap than Aiko had seen in 2 years. Real soap, not the gritty wartime substitute that left skin raw. The lieutenant demonstrated how to use the outdoor showers, explained the schedule for meals and work assignments, and repeated again that no male personnel would approach them without permission and a female officer present. Aiko watched for the trap, the moment when kindness would peel away to reveal cruelty beneath. But it did not come. Not that day and not the next. By the third day, some of the women began to speak in whispers during meals. By the fifth day, a few even ventured to ask Kenji questions when he came to help distribute supplies. Aiko remained silent, observing. She had learned during the war that survival often meant watching, waiting, understanding the patterns before committing to trust. She watched how Sergeant Reed always knocked before entering their barracks, even though he had every right to enter unannounced. She watched how Lieutenant Hale checked on them twice daily, asking in careful, translated questions if they needed anything, if anyone was sick, if the rations were sufficient. She watched how the young guard at the gate, the one with the baby face who had first pulled back the truck canvas, turned away every time a male soldier wandered too close to their compound, firmly but without hostility, just doing his job as though protecting them was the most natural thing in the world. The work assignments came in the second week. Kenji explained that according to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be required to work, but only in non-military capacities, and they would be paid wages, not much but real money they could use at the camp commissary or save to send home when mail service was established. The irony of being paid to work as a prisoner struck Aiko as absurd, another American contradiction she could not yet parse. The women were divided into groups, some for laundry, some for mending uniforms, some for vegetable gardening in the cleared area behind the kitchens. Aiko was assigned to the sewing detail, and she was grateful for this small mercy. Her mother had taught her to sew, and the repetitive motion of needle through fabric was meditative, almost peaceful. The sewing room was in a separate building, well lit with windows that caught the morning sun. Lieutenant Hale supervised, sitting at a desk in the corner with paperwork while the women worked. Sometimes she hummed while she wrote, American songs that sounded strange and angular to Aiko's ear. After a week of silence, one of the younger women, Yuki, gathered courage and asked Kenji, who was delivering new fabric, what the song was called. He smiled, the first genuine smile Aiko had seen from him, and said it was called, Don't Fence Me In. Yuki repeated the title in halting English, and Lieutenant Hale looked up, surprised and pleased. She sang a few lines, her voice untrained but warm, and even though Aiko didn't understand the words, she understood the longing in them. It was the same longing they all carried, the desire to be anywhere but here, to be anyone but who they had become. Trust, Aiko learned, was not a single decision but 1,000 small ones, accumulated over time like sediment-forming stone. It was Lieutenant Hale bringing them extra thread in different colors so their mending could be beautiful, not just functional. It was Sergeant Reed organizing a system where they could request specific foods from the commissary, and then actually delivering those requests, rice crackers, dried fish, even green tea when it could be found. It was the camp doctor, Dr. Margaret Chen, a Chinese-American woman who spoke some Japanese, and who conducted examinations with such gentle professionalism that even the most frightened women eventually consented. It was the way Kenji started teaching them English phrases during lunch breaks, not because he was ordered to but because he seemed to believe it would help them, that language could be a tool rather than a barrier. Aiko began learning English with a hunger she didn't expect. Good morning. Thank you. Please. I understand. Simple words that felt like small acts of rebellion against her own fear. Sometimes, when Lieutenant Hale passed by during sewing detail, Aiko would try out a new phrase, and the lieutenant would nod encouragingly and correct her pronunciation with patience. The other women noticed Aiko's efforts and began to follow. Soon the sewing room filled with halting English attempts, with laughter when someone mangled a word, with the strange intimacy of shared vulnerability. They were learning to inhabit this liminal space between captivity and something else, something that didn't yet have a name. But the world beyond their compound did not exist in a vacuum. Rumors traveled across the island like spores on the wind, invisible but pervasive. There was a larger Japanese POW camp on the other side of the base, housing male prisoners, soldiers who had surrendered after months in the jungle, men who carried their defeat like open wounds. Aiko knew they existed but had never seen them, and she was grateful for the distance. Then the leaflets began appearing, slipped under their barracks door at night, tucked into fabric deliveries, scattered near the fence line where women walked for exercise. The leaflets were in Japanese, crudely printed, filled with accusations and rage. They claimed the American promises were lies. They claimed the women were being used, defiled, turned into collaborators. They claimed that no Japanese woman could possibly be treated well by the enemy and remain honorable. Aiko read one leaflet and felt her stomach turn. The words were designed to poison the fragile trust they had been building, to make them doubt their own eyes and experiences. Some of the women began to withdraw again, refusing to speak during meals, watching the American personnel with renewed suspicion. Kenji tried to explain that the leaflets came from Lieutenant Nakamura, a bitter Japanese officer in the male compound who was spreading propaganda to destabilize camp order. He cannot accept surrender, Kenji said quietly during an evening assembly. He believes death would have been preferable, and he especially cannot accept that women might find any measure of peace here, because it challenges everything he was taught about honor. Sergeant Reed addressed them directly that night with Kenji translating. "I know someone is trying to frighten you," he said, his voice carrying across the barracks. "I know they're telling you that we're lying, that we're hurting you, but look at the facts. Look at what has actually happened here. Have we touched you? Have we disrespected you? Have we kept our promises?" He paused, letting them consider. "I can't control what people say, but I can control what we do. And we will continue to protect you, continue to treat you with dignity, as long as you are in our care. That is not propaganda. That is fact." Aiko wanted to believe him. Most days she did believe him. But the leaflets wormed into her thoughts during the dark hours before dawn when sleep wouldn't come. What if this was all an elaborate deception? What if the real abuse was coming later? What if they were being fattened up for slaughter like livestock? She hated that these thoughts existed in her mind, but she couldn't evict them entirely. They coexisted with her growing trust, two opposing truths that somehow both felt real. The tension escalated when Sergeant Reed announced new security measures. The fence line would be reinforced. All male personnel would require written authorization to approach within 50 meters of the women's compound. All deliveries would be inspected. The commissary trips, which had been small windows of freedom, would now require armed escort. These changes felt like punishment, even though Aiko understood they were protection. The invisible barrier between them and the male POW compound had become palpable, charged with hostility and misunderstanding. Then came the incident that nearly shattered everything. A young American private, barely 20 years old, approached the fence one afternoon carrying a small package. He meant well. Aiko could see it in his earnest face, his careful movements. He had heard the women liked chocolate, and he wanted to share his rations. Before he could get within 10 meters, Sergeant Reed appeared from nowhere, his voice sharp as gunfire. "Private Morrison, step back from that fence right now." The private froze, confused. "Sir, I don't care what you were just. The rules are clear." No male personnel approach without authorization. You've just violated direct orders. The sergeant made the private drop the chocolate in the mud and walk away, and Aiko watched through the fence as humiliation colored the young man's face. But she also understood what Sergeant Reed had done. He had enforced the rule visibly, publicly, so that anyone watching, including whoever was spreading the leaflets, could see that the promises were not empty words. That night, Aiko took out her music box and wound it carefully. The mechanism was delicate, old, and the tinny melody that emerged was a lullaby her father used to hum while working in his shop. She let it play, and soon other women gathered around her bunk, drawn by the familiar sound. They sat in silence, listening to this small piece of home, this reminder that they had existed before the war, before the fear, before the surrender. When the music box wound down, no one spoke. They just returned to their bunks, each woman carrying the melody in her own private way. The breakthrough came in the form of Red Cross letters. Lieutenant Hale announced that they could now write to their families in Japan, that the letters would be processed through official channels and sent home. Aiko's hand shook as she took the paper and pencil. What could she possibly say? How could she explain where she was, what had happened, without causing more pain? She stared at the blank page for an hour before finally writing, "Dear Father, I am safe. I am alive. They are treating us well here. I hope you are also safe. Please know that I think of you every day. Your daughter, Aiko." Simple words, inadequate and vast all at once. She sealed the letter and gave it to Kenji, who promised it would be sent within the week. Weeks passed, and no replies came. Aiko tried not to let hope die, but it was difficult. Perhaps the letters were not really being sent. Perhaps this too was a lie, a way to pacify them. Then her letter came back, stamped undeliverable, address destroyed. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her father's shop, her childhood home, the street where she had learned to ride a bicycle, all gone, destroyed. She did not know if her father was alive or dead. She sat on her bunk, clutching the returned letter, and for the first time since arriving at the camp, she allowed herself to cry. Not quietly, not carefully, but with the full weight of her grief. Lieutenant Hale found her that way, tears streaming, shoulders shaking. The lieutenant sat down beside her, not touching but present, and waited until the crying subsided. Then, through Kenji who had followed, she said, "I'm so sorry about your home. I can't imagine what you're feeling. But please know that we will keep trying. We'll search for your father through every channel available. You're not alone in this." Aiko looked up at her, at this American woman who owed her nothing, who had every reason to treat her as just another prisoner, and saw genuine compassion. It was that compassion that finally broke through Aiko's last defenses. She was not alone. Not entirely. The music box broke a few days later, the delicate spring mechanism finally giving up after years of use. Aiko tried to wind it, but the key turned uselessly, producing no sound. It felt like an omen, like everything precious and beautiful was destined to be destroyed by this war that refused to end even after the formal surrender. She showed the broken box to Kenji during English lesson, trying to explain in halting English what it had meant to her. He held it carefully, examining the mechanism, then said something that surprised her. "I can fix it, or rather, I know someone who can. One of the engineers in the motor pool is a watchmaker. He loves this kind of work. Would you trust me to take it to him?" Trust. That word again. Aiko hesitated, then nodded. She trusted Kenji now, she realized. Trusted him enough to hand over her most precious possession. 3 days later, he returned the music box, the mechanism repaired, the melody clear and true. But there was more. The watchmaker had also engraved something on the bottom. A tiny cherry blossom, exquisitely detailed. "He wanted you to know," Kenji said, "that broken things can be mended, that beauty can be restored." Aiko traced the engraving with her finger and felt something shift in her understanding of who these Americans were, what they were capable of when they chose kindness over cruelty. It was Kenji who proposed the idea of public testimony. He came to the sewing room one afternoon with Sergeant Reed and Lieutenant Hale, all three looking serious. "The propaganda is getting worse," Kenji said. Lieutenant Nakamura has convinced many of the male prisoners that you are being dishonored here. They're planning a protest, possibly a riot. The base commander wants to shut down the rumors with facts. He wants to hold a formal assembly where any of you who are willing can testify about your treatment here. It would be voluntary. No one would force you to speak. But if even one or two of you were willing to state publicly what has happened, what has not happened, it could make a difference. The room fell silent. Speaking publicly in front of officers and prisoners, putting their names to testimony that contradicted the propaganda, it was a risk that went beyond physical danger. It was a risk to whatever remained of their reputations, their futures. If Japan heard that they had defended their American captors, what would that make them? Collaborators? Traitors? Aiko felt the weight of the choice settling over her like a heavy coat. She looked at the other women, saw the same calculation happening behind their eyes. Then she thought of Sergeant Reed turning away the well-meaning private. Thought of Lieutenant Hale singing American songs while they sewed. Thought of her repaired music box with its tiny engraved cherry blossom. Thought of all the small promises that had been kept, day after day, week after week. "I will do it," Aiko said in English, the words clear and firm. Kenji's eyes widened. "Are you certain? You understand what it means?" Aiko switched to Japanese. "I understand. I understand that the truth is uncomfortable and complicated. But I also understand that lies are poison. Someone needs to say what has actually happened here. Why not me?" The assembly was scheduled for the following week, giving time for the women to prepare, for the base commander to arrange the logistics. In those days, Aiko felt the eyes of the entire camp on their compound. The male POWs knew something was coming. Lieutenant Nakamura sent one final leaflet, this one more vicious than the others, calling any woman who would testify a whore and a traitor. Aiko read it and felt anger replace fear. A cleaner, sharper emotion. She burned the leaflet in the small stove used for heating water and watched the paper curl into ash. On the morning of the assembly, the sky was brilliantly clear, the Pacific sun harsh and unforgiving. Aiko dressed carefully in the clean uniform the Americans had provided, combed her hair until it shone, and took deep breaths to steady her nerves. 5 other women had also volunteered to testify, but Aiko would speak first. They walked to the assembly area, a cleared space with a raised platform, rows of chairs for American officers, and a separate section for male Japanese POWs who had been brought under heavy guard. Aiko could feel their hostility radiating across the distance, could see Lieutenant Nakamura's contemptuous sneer. The base commander, a colonel with gray hair and tired eyes, opened the proceedings. Kenji translated as the colonel explained the purpose of the assembly. To address rumors, to establish facts, to ensure that all prisoners understood their treatment was being conducted according to international law. Then he called Aiko forward. She climbed the platform steps, her legs steady despite the fear coursing through her. She stood at the microphone, a strange device she had practiced with the day before, and looked out at the assembled faces. American officers watching with professional interest. Male Japanese prisoners watching with suspicion and anger. Her fellow women watching with hope and dread. She began to speak in Japanese, knowing Kenji would translate for the Americans. "My name is Aiko Tanaka. I am from Osaka. I have been a prisoner in this camp for 8 weeks. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When we arrived, we expected to be treated as the propaganda told us we would be treated. We expected violence. We expected assault. We expected to die." Her voice was steady, clear. "We were wrong." A murmur ran through the male prisoners. Lieutenant Nakamura shouted something, but the guards silenced him. Aiko continued. "The Americans made rules. They said no soldier would touch us. They kept that rule. We said we wanted female medical care. They provided it. They said we would be paid wages for our work. We were paid. They said we could write letters home. We wrote them and they were sent." She looked directly at Lieutenant Nakamura. "You call us dishonored. But I ask you, what is honor? Is it refusing to see truth? Is it spreading lies because the truth is inconvenient? I have not been dishonored here. I have been treated with more dignity as a prisoner of war than I was treated in my own country during the war years. This statement caused an uproar. Guards moved to control the noise. Aiko raised her voice. I am not saying the Americans are perfect. I am not saying this situation is good. I am saying they kept their promises. When I was afraid, they protected me. When my music box broke, they fixed it. When I wanted to learn their language, they taught me. These are facts. You can choose to believe propaganda, or you can believe what I am telling you, what I have witnessed with my own eyes. She took a breath, feeling the emotion rising in her throat. We were told that surrender meant death. But we surrendered and we lived. We were told that Americans were monsters. But we lived among them and they were human. Some were kind. Some were indifferent. None were the demons from the stories. She paused, then added the final thought that had been forming in her mind for weeks. The war is over. Japan lost. That is a fact, not an opinion. We can accept that fact and try to rebuild, or we can cling to old propaganda and old hatred. But I am tired of lies. I am tired of being afraid. I choose truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. Aiko stepped back from the microphone. The silence was absolute. Then, one by one, the other 5 women came forward and gave their own testimonies, shorter, less eloquent perhaps, but equally powerful in their simplicity. Each one confirmed what Aiko had said. Each one reclaimed her voice, her name, her story. When the last woman finished, the base commander stood and thanked them formally. He announced that their testimonies would be recorded in the official camp records, would be sent to the Red Cross, would become part of the permanent documentation of this camp's operation. As they left the platform, Aiko felt lighter than she had in months. She had spoken truth to power, both American power and Japanese power, and survived. Lieutenant Nakamura was led away, still shouting, but his words had lost their poison. The other male prisoners looked confused, uncertain, their narratives suddenly complicated by the voices of women they had tried to silence. Back at their compound, Sergeant Reed stopped Aiko at the gate. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, he said through Kenji's translation. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for telling the truth. That night, Aiko wound her music box and let it play, and this time when the women gathered around, they sang along with the melody. A Japanese lullaby in an American prison camp, a small act of defiance and hope intertwined. Lieutenant Hale heard them singing and stood outside the barracks window, not intruding but listening, and when the song ended, she whispered something in English that Aiko had learned meant, beautiful. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes. Relations between the compounds remained tense but less hostile. Some of the male prisoners began to ask questions rather than hurl accusations. More letters were sent, and occasionally replies came back, not many but enough to prove the system worked. Aiko received word through the Red Cross that her father had been located in Kyoto, staying with relatives, and that he was alive and waiting for her to come home. The relief was overwhelming, a physical sensation like warm water washing over frozen skin. The war had ended, but peace was still being negotiated, one small interaction at a time. Aiko learned more English. She taught Lieutenant Hale how to properly fold origami cranes. She and the other women began playing baseball with American soldiers during supervised recreation periods, laughing at their own terrible throws, finding joy in absurdity. They were still prisoners, still powerless in many ways, but they had reclaimed something essential, their humanity, their voices, their right to be seen as complex individuals rather than symbols or propaganda tools. On the day the repatriation orders finally came through, Aiko stood at the fence looking out at the ocean, the endless Pacific that separated her from everything she had known. She thought about the girl she had been when she arrived. Terrified, broken, convinced she would die. She thought about the woman she had become. Still afraid sometimes, still scarred, but also stronger, clearer, able to distinguish truth from lies. She touched the music box in her pocket, felt the engraved cherry blossom under her fingers, and understood that this small object contained the entire story of her time here. Broken, mended, marked by the hands of strangers who became something more. Sergeant Reed, Kenji, and Lieutenant Hale came to say goodbye. There were no grand speeches, just simple acknowledgments of what they had shared. "Will you remember us?" Kenji asked. Aiko smiled, a real smile. "Every day," she said in English. "I will remember that broken things can be mended, that kindness is possible even between enemies, that truth matters, even when it's complicated." She bowed deeply, formally, and they returned the gesture. Then she and the other women boarded the transport truck that would take them to the ships, to Japan, to whatever came next. As the truck pulled away from the compound, Aiko looked back one last time. The barracks were already being prepared for new arrivals, new stories. But her story would remain, recorded in official documents, carried in the memories of everyone who had witnessed her testimony. She had spoken, and in speaking, she had transformed herself from victim to witness, from prisoner to participant in her own narrative. The Pacific wind carried the scent of salt and rain, and somewhere in the distance, the ocean sang its endless song of breaking and mending, destruction and renewal, the ancient rhythm that outlasted all wars and all stories. Aiko closed her eyes and let the wind carry her forward into the uncertain future, no longer afraid of what lay ahead, because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that she could survive the truth, and that survival was its own quiet form of victory.